I found out I had a grandson on a Tuesday morning, while drinking coffee alone at my kitchen table. My daughter hadn't called. She hadn't written. For 3 months, she had let the whole world celebrate the birth of her baby, except me. I only knew because her face appeared on my phone screen, smiling in a photograph I was never meant to see, holding a child I didn't even know existed. It was a repost from a cousin in Des Moines who probably assumed I was already in on the secret. The caption said, "3 months of loving baby Leo." I stared at that blue-eyed boy until my coffee went stone cold. I live in a quiet suburb of Indianapolis, in the same house where I raised Claire after her mother passed away. I gave her everything. I worked 35 years at the post office, picking up every overtime shift just to make sure she had the best of everything. I thought family meant something more than a digital ghosting. I tried to call her immediately. It went straight to voicemail, just like it had for the last half year. We hadn't had a blow-up fight or a dramatic falling out. She had just started drifting after she married Marcus. He's a high-level corporate attorney downtown, the kind of man who looks at a retired mailman like I'm a piece of outdated machinery. I drove over to their place in Carmel that afternoon. I didn't care if I was intruding. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel as I pulled into their pristine circular driveway. There was a stroller on the front porch, an expensive-looking thing with chrome wheels. I stood at the door for 5 minutes before I found the courage to knock. When Claire finally opened it, she didn't look happy to see me. She didn't even look surprised. She just looked tired, leaning against the frame with a protective hand on her hip, blocking the view of the hallway behind her. "You shouldn't have come here, Dad," she said. Her voice was flat, devoid of the warmth I'd spent 28 years cultivating. I told her I'd seen the photo. I told her I knew about Leo. I asked her how she could keep a grandson from his own grandfather. I reminded her that I was the one who sat up with her every night when she had the croup. I reminded her that I paid for her wedding, even though Marcus's family could have bought the whole venue with their pocket change. She didn't budge. She told me that she and Marcus had decided on a low-stress environment for the baby's first year. Apparently, my presence was considered a stressor. Just as I started to plead with her, a black SUV pulled into the driveway. Marcus stepped out, adjusted his tie, and looked at me with a cold, calculated pity that made my skin crawl. He didn't say hello. He just walked up to his wife, put a hand on her shoulder, and asked if there was a problem. I realized then that this wasn't just a secret. It was a coordinated exclusion. Marcus didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. He just stood there in his $3,000 suit, looking at me like I was a trespasser on his manicured lawn. "Robert, we're in the middle of a private family afternoon," he said, his tone as sharp as a razor. I looked at Claire, waiting for her to defend me, to say something about the 30 years of life we'd shared. She just looked at the ground. I told them I wasn't leaving until I saw the boy. I told them I had a right to know my own flesh and blood. Marcus stepped closer, his shadow falling over me. He told me that rights were a legal concept, and as far as he was concerned, I had none. He mentioned that they had documented my unstable behavior, which was nothing more than me calling twice a week to check in, and that if I didn't get in my car, he'd call the Carmel police. I felt a heat in my chest that I haven't felt since I was a young man. I told him I raised the woman he was holding on to, and I did it without a silver spoon or a law degree. I did it with honest work and sacrifice. Claire finally looked up, but her eyes were filled with a strange, icy resentment. "That's the problem, Dad," she whispered. "You always lead with what you gave me, like I'm a debt you're trying to collect." It felt like a physical blow to the stomach. I've lived my whole life for her. When her mother died, I didn't date. I didn't travel. I worked and I saved. Every dollar went into her college fund, her braces, her first car. I thought I was building a foundation of love, but she was looking at it like a bill she never asked for. I backed away, stumbling slightly on the brick walkway. I got into my sedan and sat there for a moment, watching them through the windshield. They didn't go inside. They waited until I started the engine, making sure I was actually retreating. As I backed out, I saw a curtain move in the upstairs window. A woman I didn't recognize, probably a nanny, was holding a small bundle in a white blanket. That was my first glimpse of my grandson in person, a blur of white fabric behind a pane of glass. I drove home to my empty house, the silence in the kitchen louder than it had ever been. That evening, I did something I'm not proud of. I started digging through Claire's social media from a fake account I'd set up months ago just to see her travel photos. I found an album titled The Journey. There were dozens of photos. Claire at the hospital, Claire at her baby shower in a fancy restaurant downtown, Marcus holding the baby in a nursery that looked like it belonged in a palace. My sister was in the photos. My cousins were there. Even my old neighbors from our street had been invited to the shower. Everyone had been there except for the man who had packed her lunch every day for 12 years. I realized then that this wasn't just Claire being busy or Marcus being elitist. There had been a meeting. A decision had been made by people I loved to cut me out of the narrative. I picked up the phone and called my sister, Martha. She picked up on the third ring. When I asked her why she was at a baby shower for a grandchild I didn't know existed, she got quiet. "Claire said you were taking some space, Robert," she said softly. "She told us you were struggling with the house and didn't want to be bothered." The lie was so effortless it made my blood run cold. My own daughter had buried me alive while I was still standing. Martha's voice was full of a pity that felt like an insult. She told me that Claire had described me as confused and obsessed with the past. It was the same tactic I'd heard about in stories of families trying to push the older generation aside to gain control or just to clear the path. I hung up the phone and walked through my house, looking at the tally marks I'd carved into the pantry door frame to measure Claire's height every year. I had kept this place exactly the same for her, a shrine to a childhood she was now using as a weapon against me. I realized then that I wasn't just losing a grandson. I was being erased from my own life story by the person I had sacrificed everything to protect. The next morning, a courier arrived at my door. He didn't have a gift or a birth announcement. He had a thick manila envelope from a law firm in downtown Indianapolis. Not Marcus's firm, but one just as expensive. I sat at my kitchen table, the same place where I'd helped Claire with her math homework for a decade, and read the formal cease and desist notice. It alleged that my unannounced appearance at their home had caused Claire severe emotional distress and threatened legal action if I attempted to contact them again. They were treating me like a common stalker instead of the man who had walked her down the aisle. I looked at the signature at the bottom. It wasn't just a lawyer. Marcus had signed as a witness to my erratic behavior. I felt a coldness settle in my bones, a realization that they weren't just avoiding me. They were building a case. If they could prove I was mentally unfit or a threat, they could ensure I never saw Leo, and perhaps even move toward a guardianship that would give them control over the modest estate I'd worked 39 years to build. I had paid off this house and saved every penny so Claire would never have to worry. Now, those very savings were likely the target of their concern. I called an old friend, Joe, who had retired from the police force a few years back. We met at a diner on Washington Street. When I showed him the letter, his face hardened. He told me that in his experience, letters like this aren't just about privacy, they're about leverage. He suggested I check my bank accounts. I told him he was being paranoid. I was the only one on my accounts. But as I sat there, I remembered a dinner 2 years ago, right before the wedding, when Marcus had helped me consolidate some of my old retirement paperwork to make things easier for my future. I drove straight to the bank. The teller looked at me with a strange, hesitant expression. When I asked for a printout of my savings balance, she took a long time in the back office. When she returned, she slid a piece of paper across the counter that made the room spin. My savings account, the one intended for Claire's inheritance and my own care, had been depleted by nearly $40,000 over the last 6 months. The withdrawals were all electronic, authorized by a secondary user I had forgotten I'd even added during that consolidation dinner. I stood there in the lobby, surrounded by the hum of business, realizing that while I was mourning the loss of a daughter, she and her husband were already spending my life's work. The manager at the bank was polite, but his words were like ice water. He showed me the digital signatures, authorized, legal, and final. I had signed those papers 2 years ago, thinking I was letting Marcus help me manage the burden of my finances. I realized then that my daughter and her husband hadn't just been waiting for me to fade away. They had been actively dismantling my life while I was still living in it. I walked out into the bright Indianapolis sun, feeling like a ghost in my own city. I had spent 39 years working for the people of this state, and now I was being treated like a problem to be solved. I drove to a small law office on the south side, far away from the glass towers where Marcus worked. The lawyer, a man named Henderson, looked at the cease and desist and the bank statements. He didn't sugarcoat it. He told me that in the eyes of the law, I had handed over the keys to my own kingdom. He asked me if I had any proof that the withdrawals weren't gifts. I told him the truth. I hadn't even known they were happening. I told him about the baby, about Leo, and how I was being kept away like a criminal. Henderson leaned back and told me that if I fought this, it wouldn't be a quiet family chat. It would be a war. I went back to the house and found the nursery I had started building in the spare bedroom 6 months ago. I had bought a handmade wooden crib and a rocking chair, thinking Claire would eventually come around. I sat in that chair in the dark, wondering how the little girl who used to hold my hand so tight grew up to be someone who could steal from her own father. I realized she wasn't just avoiding me because she was busy. She was avoiding me because she couldn't look at the man she was robbing. That night, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. It was a photo of a legal document, a petition for a temporary restraining order. Below, it was a message from Marcus. "We tried to do this the easy way, Robert. Stay away from our house and our son, or we will have you escorted to a psychiatric evaluation for your own good." They were going to use my grief and my confusion as evidence that I was losing my mind. I didn't sleep. At 4 in the morning, I started packing a box of old photos. I found the one of Claire's mother holding her at the hospital 28 years ago. I realized that the woman in that photo would have been horrified by what our daughter had become. I wasn't going to sit in the dark anymore. If they wanted to treat me like a threat, I was going to show them exactly what a man with nothing left to lose looks like. I decided that if they were going to use the law to bury me, I would use the truth to dig myself back out. I didn't spend 39 years delivering mail through Indiana winters without learning how to track a trail. If Marcus thought a few digital signatures and a fancy letterhead would make me roll over, he'd forgotten who taught Claire how to stand her ground. I spent the next 3 days at the Central Library downtown, digging through public records and filing my own requests for information. I wasn't looking for photos of the baby anymore. I was looking for the paper trail they thought I was too old to understand. I found that Marcus's high-level law firm had been quietly dealing with internal audits for months, and their lifestyle in Carmel was built on a foundation of debt that was rapidly crumbling. The $40,000 they took from me hadn't been for a college fund or a nursery. It had been used to cover 3 months of mortgage payments on a house they couldn't afford. They hadn't hidden Leo from me because they wanted a low-stress environment. They had hidden him because they were terrified I would see the desperation behind their perfect front. I realized then that I wasn't being excluded because I was a burden. I was being silenced because I was a witness to their fraud. Every time I had called to check in, I wasn't just a stressor. I was a reminder of the money they owed and the lies they were telling to their social circles. On Thursday afternoon, I didn't go to their house. I went to the office of the senior partner at Marcus's firm. I wore my best Sunday suit and carried a folder full of bank statements and the cease and desist they had sent me. I told the receptionist I was there to discuss a private family matter involving one of their associates and a potential conflict of interest. 10 minutes later, I was sitting in a room that smelled of expensive leather and old money. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. I simply laid the documents on the table and explained that my son-in-law was using my life savings to subsidize a lifestyle he couldn't maintain, all while using legal threats to keep me from my grandson. The partner's face didn't change, but his eyes went cold. He thanked me for my time and told me they would look into the matter internally. When I walked out of that building, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders, but it was replaced by a hollow ache in my heart. I knew that by protecting myself, I was likely ending Marcus's career. I was choosing my own survival over the success of the man my daughter loved. But then I remembered Claire's face as she watched me from the driveway, and I realized she had already made her choice. She had chosen a house in Carmel over her father's life. When I got home, there were 6 missed calls from Claire. I didn't answer. Then came a text, the first one she'd sent in months that didn't involve a lawyer. "Dad, what did you do? Marcus is being placed on leave. Please, we have a baby to think about. Don't do this to us." I sat at my kitchen table and looked at the rocking chair in the spare room. They were finally thinking about the baby, but only because their own comfort was at risk. I realized then that the family I thought I was protecting had died a long time ago. I didn't call her back. I knew if I heard her voice, she would try to use the same soft tones she used when she was a little girl, back when I was the one fixing her scraped knees and broken toys. But the woman who sent that text wasn't that girl. She was the woman who had stood by while her husband forged my signature and drained my future. An hour later, a car pulled into my gravel driveway with a screech. It was Claire. She didn't knock. She burst through the front door, her face red and her eyes wild with a desperation I had never seen. She didn't ask how I was. She didn't mention the grandson she'd kept hidden for 3 months. "You've ruined us, Dad," she screamed, standing in the middle of the kitchen I had paid for with 39 years of labor. She told me that Marcus had been escorted from his office and that the bank was already calling about the missed payments. I looked at her and asked, for the first time, why she did it. I asked why my grandson's birth was a secret and why my life savings were treated like a slush fund. She broke down then, but it wasn't a confession of love. She said they were drowning and that the pressure of the life they'd built in Carmel was more than they could handle. They had planned to borrow the money and pay it back before I ever noticed, and the baby was kept away because they couldn't look me in the eye while the lie was growing. I felt a coldness settle in my stomach. I told her that I had spent my entire life making sure she never had to feel the weight of the world, and in return, she had used me as a human shield for her own vanity. I showed her the nursery I had built in the spare room, the crib, the handmade toys, the things meant for a grandson I had only seen through a glass window. She looked at the room, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of the daughter I used to know. But then her phone buzzed. It was Marcus. Even now, in my house, she was checking with him before she spoke to me. She told me that if I didn't go back to the firm and retract my statement, they would lose the house. She actually asked me to lie for them, to tell the senior partners it was all a big misunderstanding. I realized then that she didn't want my forgiveness, she wanted my compliance. I told her to leave. I told her that the man who lived in this house was done being a safety net for people who didn't respect the ground he walked on. As she walked out, she said I was tearing the family apart. I stood at the window and watched her drive away, realizing that the only thing left of my family were the tally marks on the pantry door and a grandson I might only ever know through a courtroom transcript. The legal proceedings moved with a cold, mechanical speed that matched the silence in my home. Marcus was officially terminated from his firm, and the bank moved to reclaim the funds they had taken from my accounts. My lawyer, Henderson, informed me that because of the unauthorized digital signatures and the evidence of Marcus's financial instability, the restitution would be taken from the sale of their home in Carmel. I stayed in my house on the south side, walking past the empty nursery every morning. I had spent my life building a legacy, but I ended up with a pile of legal documents and a daughter who only contacted me through a court-appointed mediator. The house in Carmel went on the market in late October. I didn't go to see it. I didn't want to see the circular driveway or the upstairs window where I had caught that first glimpse of Leo. My sister, Martha, tried to call me a few times to tell me that Claire and Marcus had moved into a 2-bedroom apartment near Fisher's. She said they were struggling and that I should be the bigger person. I told her that I had been the bigger person for 30 years, and all it had done was provide them with a target. I didn't feel like a hero or a victor. I just felt like a man who had finally stopped paying for people who didn't love him. A week before Thanksgiving, a small package arrived on my porch. There was no return address, just a local postmark from Indianapolis. Inside was a single printed photograph. It wasn't a professional portrait or a staged social media post. It was a candid shot of a little boy sitting on a blanket in a park, reaching for a fallen leaf. He had my nose and the same stubborn set to his jaw that I see in the mirror every morning. On the back, in Claire's handwriting, were 4 words. His middle name is Robert. I looked at the photo for a long time, tracing the edges of the paper. I thought about the $40,000, the forged signatures, the cease and desist, and the night my daughter screamed that I had ruined her life. I thought about the man who had delivered mail for nearly 4 decades, so she would never have to want for anything. I realized that the name on the back of the photo wasn't an olive branch. It was a reminder of what they had thrown away. I didn't call her. I didn't drive to Fisher's. I walked into the kitchen, opened the drawer by the sink, and found a roll of tape. I went to the pantry door and taped the photo of Leo directly next to the tally marks where I had measured Claire's height for 18 years. I stood there for a moment, looking at the history of a family that no longer existed. Then I turned off the kitchen light, sat down at my table, and finished my coffee in the dark. If this story meant something to you, subscribe. There's more to come.